This is the AD History Podcast.
And something else I was curious about is the Emperor's dream of the solid gold man who was glowing and who flew away to the west. That sounds so wonderfully fitting. It's such a nice little story. Have we got much evidence on that? Do you think that is the true origin of how Buddhism began in China? Do you think that reflects the reality at all?
Well, it certainly does have a poetic quality to it. So basically, the way most scholars understand how Buddhism began diffusing into China 2,000 years ago, a lot of that historians believe was actually the product of Silk Road traders, which makes a lot of sense because in the case of Buddhism and the various aspects of the story with Ming of Han that I told, is that it's pretty well understood at this point that Buddhism really began taking root in Western China. And it should be noted, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners do know this, but if you don't, it's still important to know, is that China, in the various shapes geographically that it's taken, is far from just the Han Chinese, which is what most folks think about when they think about a Chinese person. So even today, it's said that the PRC recognizes something like 53 ethnic minorities in China. And because of its size, you're getting a lot of different people with differing ideas and differing backgrounds that change the scope and complexity entirely. So that's worth pointing out. So they believe it came through Silk Road traders, a lot of which, interestingly enough, apparently were traveling through, and not to reference ourselves again, but the Kushan Empire. As you might imagine these sort of things would.
We've heard of them before.
Yeah, yes. And certainly not the last we'll hear of them.
No.
But in this case, most scholars believe that it was coming through the Silk Road and that it had an organic process of proliferating through Western China. And while the story of Ming of Han certainly is probably based in more than a few kernels of truth, based on what we know about him and his actions, that at some point he probably heard about this and wanted to know more, and then sent out official emissaries to find those who could bring it back. That's part of this that makes sense, especially when you consider that he was the one that was responsible for the White Horse Temple, and in addition to his other established personal traits, especially as a particularly learned individual who had an incredible knowledge and sought a much greater knowledge about religion, spirituality, metaphysics, things like that, that you would imagine Buddhism was probably right up his alley.
Yes, and if there's something I've learned from doing this and from Name Explain when it comes to studying history, and that's if there's a nice, compact, really easy to understand story about how something happened, it probably isn't true. Like most of the time, that's the case. It's
Oh man, it just sets up red flags everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
It's like you just can't help but assume. I hate saying the word skeptic because skeptic is kind of strange, but it certainly begins raising a lot of questions that you need answered very quickly because history is so seldom, if ever, that straightforward. I mean, I suppose it happens, but when it's this long ago and you get a story such as that, you have to stop back and ask yourself, well, what else was going on here? Because could this all be just the product of one particular monarch's interest? And how does that fit into the reality of where we know it came from and its potential for getting there? That kind of thing.
But even if that story isn't true, it's still amazing to know that was the Silk Road. Like, everything is exported down the Silk Road, including religion.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. The Silk Road brought, to and fro, not just goods and commerce, but ideas and beliefs and understandings of the universe in a way that really, when you stop and think about it, it makes a lot of sense. And anytime you're dealing with any sort of foreign influence in a country for both positive and negative effect, there are many times when it is very much the product of a great many different people over an extended period of time coming to that place with their ideas in mind. Not necessarily because they're missionaries or monks, but simply because the people who are doing the hard work in those places and taking those trips, it's almost it's something that you can't, it's a historical force that's almost unresistible. Because people are innately curious. We have questions. We have questions that, based on current circumstances, we can't answer. But you encounter something that is otherwise foreign to your experience that might have an ability to help you seek out and understand the answers that you desire. It's very much part and parcel to the whole human experience. We are innately curious about everything.
Be sure to follow and subscribe for upcoming AD History podcast episodes, available wherever podcasts are found.